The boarding gate was crowded, buzzing with the usual chaos of a late afternoon flight. Travelers shuffled in lines, balancing coffees and rolling bags, impatiently checking their phones as the boarding groups were called. Businessmen in suits looked annoyed, families tried to wrangle children, and tourists carried oversized backpacks stuffed with souvenirs. Amid the noise and motion, a woman in a gray hoodie and worn jeans quietly scanned her ticket, offered the flight attendant a polite nod, and stepped onto the jet bridge. She carried no designer luggage, no rolling suitcase with polished wheels. Just a duffel bag, plain olive green, the kind that looked like it had seen more than airports. It slung easily over her shoulder, as if weight meant nothing to her, though anyone else would have found it cumbersome. She walked with quiet confidence, but not arrogance. Her steps were measured, steady, as if she was used to moving through crowded spaces without drawing attention. Inside the aircraft, the press of bodies intensified. Passengers stuffed bags into overhead bins and jockeyed for position in the narrow aisle. The air was thick with frustration, and the faint smell of recycled air conditioning mixed with coffee. She slipped through the line without a word, stepping aside when someone rushed past, waiting patiently while a man argued with a flight attendant about bin space. Her ticket read 22C, middle of coach. No extra legroom, no window to lean against, just a regular seat surrounded by strangers. She didn't mind. After years of cramped cockpits, long-haul military flights, and deployment transports, a seat in coach felt almost luxurious. She slid into place, tucking her duffel beneath the seat in front of her, pulling her cap low over her brow. The couple across the aisle noticed her almost immediately. They were polished, the kind of travelers who flew often, but not often enough to earn first-class upgrades. He wore a tailored jacket, his hair slicked back, and scrolled through his phone with a smirk. She wore a designer sweater, bracelets that jingled softly every time she moved, and leaned close to whisper. "Look at that bag," the woman said, tilting her chin toward the duffel. "It looks like something out of an army surplus store." Her partner chuckled, loud enough for the comment to travel. "Coach seat, beat-up bag. Bet she's not a frequent flyer. Probably her first time out of state." They laughed quietly together, but their voices carried in the cramped space. The woman in 22C heard them clearly. She didn't flinch, didn't turn her head. Instead, she pulled the airline magazine from the seat pocket and flipped it open, as if she hadn't noticed. But she had. Years in uniform had taught her patience and armor against insults, doubts, and the sideways looks she'd endured more times than she could count. She knew what she looked like in this moment. Ordinary, unremarkable, someone who blended into the crowd. No medals gleamed on her chest. No insignia marked her rank. Out of uniform, she was invisible. The couple kept whispering. At one point, the man leaned back, pretending to stretch, then said in a stage whisper voice, "She's got that look. Military, maybe? Doesn't really fit though, does she?" The woman across the aisle giggled. "Military? Please. She'd be in first class if she was important. Not stuck back here in 22C with us." The comment stung, though she refused to let it show. She had been underestimated before. She had been dismissed, doubted, even mocked. It didn't matter in the end. The skies had taught her that words meant little compared to action. She stared at the glossy magazine pages, but her mind drifted elsewhere, back to dusty airfields, roaring engines, and the weight of a helmet pressing against her skull as she adjusted her oxygen mask. She remembered night missions when the cockpit lights glowed faintly green, and the only sound was the hum of instruments and the steady rhythm of her own breathing. She remembered calls crackling over comms, split-second decisions that saved lives, and the unshakable calm that came when her training kicked in under fire. None of those moments were visible here. To the couple across the aisle, she was just a woman with a beat-up bag and a middle seat. Nothing more. The flight attendants moved down the aisle, greeting passengers, helping stow bags, and reminding everyone to buckle up. The couple smiled at them, speaking with an air of superiority, as if demanding recognition. The woman in 22C simply nodded when the attendant passed her row, quiet and polite. The plane filled quickly. Children fussed, overhead bins slammed shut, and passengers fumbled with seatbelts. The cabin was alive with impatience. She settled into her seat, adjusting her cap lower, letting herself disappear into the noise. The couple across the aisle noticed her silence and smirked again. "Not very chatty, is she?" the woman murmured. Her partner leaned closer, whispering loudly enough to be heard. "Maybe she's embarrassed. People like her usually are." She kept her gaze fixed forward, hands resting loosely in her lap. A part of her wanted to speak, to cut their arrogance with a sharp remark. But another part of her, the part shaped by years of discipline, chose otherwise. Words wouldn't change anything. Silence, she had learned, often carried far more weight. As the engines roared to life and the plane began to taxi, she closed her eyes briefly. She didn't pray, didn't fidget, didn't scroll through a phone like everyone else. She simply breathed, steady and calm, as though the motion of the aircraft was nothing unusual to her. Because it wasn't. She had felt the lift of countless takeoffs, the surge of acceleration far greater than anything this commercial jet could muster. For her, flight was second nature. But for the others around her, including the mocking couple, this was just another plane ride. Just another trip. Just another seat. And so, the woman in 22C sat quietly, blending in, humiliated by whispers, yet untouched by them, carrying within her the unspoken truth. She had flown higher, faster, and farther than anyone else on that plane could imagine. They saw only what was in front of them. They couldn't see what lived in her past, or what was about to unfold above the clouds. The hum of the engines grew steady as the aircraft climbed, leveling into smooth flight. The seatbelt sign blinked off with a soft chime, and passengers began their usual rituals, laptops opened, snacks unwrapped, earbuds inserted to drown out the monotony. The couple across the aisle returned to their whispered comments, occasionally casting glances her way, convinced they'd already judged her correctly. But inside, the woman in 22C was elsewhere entirely. She leaned back against the seat, her eyes fixed on nothing, and let her mind wander. Civilians often filled silence with idle chatter. For her, silence was a landscape of memory, and those memories carried weight that none of the strangers around her could ever truly comprehend. Her name meant little here. It was her call sign that mattered, the name etched into the comms charter of squadrons across continents. To the world of fighter pilots, her call sign was synonymous with precision and resilience, whispered with respect in briefing rooms and over late-night beers after missions. She hadn't chosen it, of course. No pilot ever did. Call signs were earned, sometimes out of humor, sometimes out of mistakes, but hers had grown into something larger. It was not just a label, it was a reputation. She remembered the first time she'd heard it called over the radio. She had been a rookie then, strapped into a jet that still felt more like an overwhelming beast than an extension of herself. Her heart had hammered inside her chest as she joined her squadron on a training exercise, the world a blur of blue sky and sharp turns. A senior pilot had barked her call sign through the comms, and from that moment forward, it had stuck. At first, it embarrassed her. Later, it became her armor. By now, thousands of hours in the cockpit had transformed her from that nervous rookie into one of the most capable combat aviators in her wing. She had guided her aircraft through storms that turned the skies into chaos, flown low over hostile territory, where every radar ping meant danger, and completed missions that had seemed impossible on paper. Her call sign had been logged in reports, classified at the highest levels, attached to missions that civilians would never hear about, but that shifted outcomes in regions halfway across the globe. And yet, here she sat, anonymous, wedged into a narrow seat between strangers who believed she was nothing more than a coach passenger with a shabby duffel bag. She let her eyes close briefly, not to sleep, but to remember. One memory in particular surfaced a mission over rough terrain, where the weather had turned suddenly brutal. Winds whipped the aircraft, lightning split the sky, and her instruments flickered with static interference. Her squadron leader's voice had crackled through the comms, calm but urgent, assigning her the lead. Others might have panicked, but she had leaned into the training drilled into her bones. She steadied her breathing, gripped the controls, and guided her formation through turbulence, so violent it rattled teeth. When they broke free into clearer skies, her squadron's relief had come through the radios in unison and unspoken acknowledgement of trust. From that day forward, she wasn't just another pilot. She was the pilot you wanted in the skies when things went wrong. But there were darker memories, too. The times when missions didn't go as planned. The times when aircraft didn't return. She remembered walking across the tarmac after one particularly harrowing operation, her boots heavy with exhaustion, her ears still ringing from the roar of engines. Families had gathered at the edge of the runway, waiting for pilots who would never step out of their cockpits again. She had offered what little comfort she could, though words always felt empty in the face of such loss. Those were the moments that carved invisible scars, the kind no one on this flight would ever see. Her duffel bag beneath the seat carried small reminders of that life. Not medals, those stayed tucked away in drawers, never flaunted. Not photographs, either those were private, too precious for public display. What she carried were practical things. A notebook with call signs and mission notes, a well-worn patch from her squadron, a lucky coin she had kept since flight school. To anyone else, the bag looked unremarkable. To her, it was a piece of her story, the weight of service folded into fabric and zippers. The woman across the aisle stretched out her legs and glanced again at the duffel. "I still can't believe she brought that thing," she whispered to her partner, rolling her eyes. "She looks like she's on a bus, not a plane," he replied, smirking. She heard them, of course. She always did. But she didn't respond. What could she say that would change their minds? If she told them about her call sign, about the missions, about the time she had flown so close to Air Force, one she could see the reflection of its blue and white fuselage against the clouds, they would laugh harder. They would call her a liar. To them, appearances told the whole story, and appearances were all they would ever see. So she sat in silence, her posture calm, her breathing steady. She had carried heavier burdens than this before. Mockery was nothing compared to the weight of command decisions, the responsibility of guiding men and women through hostile skies, the knowledge that one mistake could alter lives forever. Still, she couldn't help but think how ironic it was that the strangers so quick to judge her were unaware of how much their safety, their very freedom to travel the skies, was protected by people like her. People who wore the uniform, flew the missions, and returned home to no applause. People who sat quietly in coach, invisible until circumstances revealed the truth. The captain's voice crackled over the intercom, announcing their cruising altitude and estimated arrival time. Passengers barely listened, returning to their screens and conversations. She smiled faintly, recognizing the steady cadence of a pilot's voice. All pilots spoke with that same rhythm, clipped and calm, trained to reassure even when turbulence loomed. It was a sound she knew intimately, a sound that reminded her she belonged to a world beyond this cramped cabin. As the hours stretched ahead, she knew she would remain quiet. There was no need to explain herself. No need to defend against whispers or laughter. She had lived a life defined not by what others believed, but by what she had done. And someday, maybe even on this very flight, those who doubted her would learn that the woman in seat 22C was not who she appeared to be. She wasn't ordinary. She was extraordinary. And the skies had never forgotten her. The cabin lights dimmed slightly as the flight attendants moved through the aisles, beginning their beverage service. The familiar clink of ice in plastic cups mingled with the hum of engines and the soft drone of passengers' conversations. It was an ordinary flight to anyone watching, but for the woman in 22C, the weight of attention was slowly tightening around her like a noose. She had hoped to disappear into anonymity, to sip her coffee, keep her head down, and let the hours pass in peace. But the couple across the aisle had other ideas. They had begun their commentary at boarding, dismissive whispers about her duffel bag and her coach seat. At first, she ignored them easily enough. After all, she'd endured worse in her career. The skepticism of commanding officers, the sideways glances of peers who doubted her place in the cockpit, even the jeers of locals in foreign countries who saw her as an unwelcome presence. Words, she had learned, were fleeting. They carried no weight unless she let them. But words also had a way of gathering momentum. The man leaned closer to his companion now, his voice pitched just loud enough to carry over the drone of the cabin. She said she was in the military, he muttered, smirking. But come on, look at her. Doesn't exactly scream fighter pilot, does she? His companion laughed softly, covering her mouth with manicured fingers. More like cafeteria staff. Or maybe she drives trucks on base. Desk job, most likely. She doesn't have that look. The woman in 22C's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. She lifted her paper cup of black coffee, holding it steady despite the small tremors of turbulence that nudged the plane. She didn't flinch, didn't rise to the bait. Her discipline ran too deep for that. But the words cut anyway, not because she believed them, but because they reflected a truth she had battled her entire career. People rarely believed she belonged. She had fought for every inch of respect, clawed her way into cockpits where others told her she'd never fit. She had proven herself not once, but again and again, each flight a silent rebuttal to those who doubted her. And yet here she was, back to being dismissed, her history erased by a stranger's assumption. The couple's laughter grew bolder. The man shifted in his seat, raising his voice as if performing for nearby passengers. "Hey," he called suddenly, turning his head toward her. "You said you were military, right? What do you do? Logistics? Or maybe you just check people in at the gate?" A few nearby passengers chuckled nervously, unsure whether to laugh along or recoil from his rudeness. The woman in 22C didn't take the bait. She glanced at him briefly, her expression unreadable, then returned her gaze to the seat back in front of her. "I served," she said simply, her voice calm but firm. Her answer only seemed to encourage him. "Served?" he repeated, nodding dramatically to his companion. "See? Past tense. Probably washed out." He chuckled, shaking his head. Not exactly Top Gun material. More laughter. Not from everyone, but enough to sting. Enough to remind her that silence had limits. She took another sip of coffee, letting the bitter liquid ground her. She could have ended it all with a single sentence, a single revelation of who she truly was. She could have mentioned her call sign, the one that carried weight far beyond this cabin. She could have told them about the jets she'd flown, the missions she'd completed, the fact that her name was known at levels of command these passengers couldn't dream of reaching. But she didn't. Not because she couldn't, but because she wouldn't. Humility was etched into her bones. Service was never about recognition. It was about duty. She didn't need the approval of strangers, who wouldn't understand her world even if she explained it. So she stayed quiet. The woman across the aisle smirked, clearly satisfied with what she thought was a victory. "Thought so," she whispered to her partner. "All talk, no proof. Probably just trying to impress people." Their mockery didn't stop with words. When the flight attendant reached their row, offering snacks and drinks, the man waved his hand with exaggerated flair. "2 wines, please," he said, grinning, then glanced at the woman in 22C. She probably doesn't know the difference between a Cabernet and a Chardonnay. The attendant forced a polite smile, handing them their drinks without comment. But the damage was done. The surrounding passengers chuckled softly, shaking their heads as if they too had decided who the woman in 22C was. She exhaled slowly, steadying her heartbeat. This wasn't combat, she reminded herself. This wasn't the cockpit. This was just another kind of turbulence, the kind that couldn't knock a plane from the sky, but could chip away at dignity if she let it. She thought back to her training, the endless drills that had taught her to compartmentalize, to separate noise from necessity. In the skies, distractions killed. Pilots learned quickly to tune out what didn't matter. This mockery was nothing more than noise. And yet, she felt the burn of humiliation in her chest. Not because their words mattered, but because they reminded her of the invisible battles she had always fought. The battles against perception, against stereotypes, against the narrow lens through which others viewed her. The man raised his cup in mock salute. "Here's to the military," he said loudly, his tone dripping with sarcasm. "And to the brave women who keep the coffee hot and the paperwork neat." The laughter that followed wasn't unanimous, but it was enough. Enough to isolate her further in that cramped row. Enough to make the seat feel smaller. Enough to remind her that the world often failed to see what was right in front of it. She didn't respond. She couldn't, not without breaking the vow she had made to herself, to stay humble, to let her service speak louder than her words. So she endured. The plane hummed on, engine steady, skies clear. Passengers returned to their screens, their magazines, their idle conversations. The couple across the aisle sipped their wine, smug and self-satisfied. And the woman in 22C sat quietly, her silence deeper than their laughter, carrying within her the truth they would never guess, that the skies had already judged her, long before this flight, and found her worthy. For now she was humiliated. But humiliation was temporary. Respect, when it came, would be undeniable. And above the clouds, events were already aligning to reveal who she truly was. The flight had settled into its rhythm. The drink carts rattled down the aisles, passengers pulled blankets around their shoulders, and the hum of the engines became the steady backdrop of the cabin. For a time, the laughter and mocking from across the aisle faded, replaced by the low murmur of idle conversations and the glow of screens. The woman in seat 22C sat still, her black coffee balanced carefully on the tray table, her eyes distant. She had become a master of silence, sitting unseen, disappearing into the background, even while the storm of words earlier had pressed in around her. Yet even she couldn't have anticipated the moment that was about to unfold. It began with a subtle change in the tone of the engines. Not in power, no. The thrust was steady, but in cadence. Pilots always knew their machines like living creatures, and she felt it first, in the way the aircraft leveled, in the slight tilt as it adjusted altitude. It wasn't dramatic enough for most passengers to notice, but she noticed. Always. The intercom chimed, and the captain's voice filled the cabin. "Ladies and gentlemen," he said, his tone calm, almost casual, "we've been instructed to hold our current course for a few moments due to restricted airspace ahead. We'll be resuming shortly." Nothing to worry about. A ripple moved through the passengers. Heads lifted from books and screens. Conversations paused, and whispers spread like a current. Restricted airspace? Someone murmured 2 rows up. Probably military training, another said. A man across the aisle, not the mocking one but another businessman, leaned toward his seatmate. No, that's usually Air Force One. When the president's plane is in the area, everything else clears the skies. The words hit the cabin like a spark. Air Force One, the president. Suddenly the chatter intensified, speculation growing louder. Passengers craned their necks toward the windows, as though they might spot something in the endless blue. For most, this was novelty, an unusual hiccup in an otherwise mundane journey. But for the woman in 22C, the announcement landed differently. Her pulse quickened, though her face betrayed nothing. She knew restricted airspace procedures intimately. She had flown near those corridors before, had adjusted her own flight path while in uniform to make way for the commander-in-chief's transport. She understood exactly how serious such restrictions were, how carefully orchestrated every movement in the sky became when Air Force One entered the picture. Her mind shifted, instinctively parsing possibilities. Where were they now? At this altitude, at this latitude, she could guess the corridor. If Air Force One was near, it meant the president was traveling either a scheduled trip or one cloaked in secrecy. And if their commercial jet was being ordered to hold, it meant they were closer than most civilians would ever realize. She didn't smile. She didn't move. But inside, a quiet knowing stirred. The couple across the aisle, predictably, seized on the moment. Restricted airspace, the man muttered, loud enough for others to hear. He shot her a glance, smirking. Hey, maybe it's for you, huh? Maybe the president doesn't want you flying too close. His companion chuckled, covering her mouth as though the comment had been a private joke. Yes, maybe she's on some secret mission, she added, rolling her eyes. Right here in coach. Nearby passengers chuckled nervously, caught between curiosity and amusement. But the woman in 22C heard none of it. Her attention was elsewhere, fixed on the subtle changes in the aircraft. She could tell from the captain's tone that this wasn't routine. Pilots didn't make announcements like that unless they'd been firmly instructed. And instructions that came from restricted airspace corridors weren't casual. They were absolute. She thought of her time in the cockpit, of the countless times she had heard similar directives. Hold your course. Adjust your heading. Restricted airspace ahead. To most pilots, it was an inconvenience. To her, it had always been a signal. The presence of power, the movement of leaders, the reminder that some skies were guarded more closely than others. Her mind wandered briefly to memories of her own encounters with Air Force One. She remembered one mission, a night operation where she had flown Escort at a distance, her jet a silent shadow in the dark sky. The president had been on board, though she never saw him, never spoke to him. Her role had been invisible but vital, to guard, to ensure safe passage, to be ready for whatever the skies demanded. She had never expected thanks. It was duty, nothing more. Now, sitting in seat 22C, she felt the weight of those memories pressing quietly against her chest. Passengers buzzed with speculation. I heard when Air Force One is in the air, they ground everything else. Do you think we'll see it? Maybe the president's on board right now. Phones lifted. People peered out of windows, though the sky beyond revealed nothing but clouds and endless blue. The mocking couple leaned into the moment, their voices carrying. Well, the man said, chuckling, at least something interesting is happening on this flight. Maybe we'll get an escort. Maybe our friend here can finally prove her military story. His partner smirked. Right, because she looks like someone the Air Force would trust. This time, their words barely reached her. She was listening too closely to the aircraft itself, to the way it shifted, to the faint vibration beneath her feet as the engines adjusted to a holding pattern. Her instincts told her this was more than a delay. Something was aligning above the clouds, something invisible to the rest of the cabin but clear as day to her. The captain returned to the intercom, his voice slightly more formal now. "Ladies and gentlemen, we appreciate your patience. We've been given further instructions. We'll be maintaining our altitude and heading until clearance is received." The whispers grew louder, excitement mingling with unease. Passengers speculated wildly, but she knew the truth. This wasn't just a random adjustment. Air Force One was near closer than any of them imagined. And when Air Force One moved, the entire sky bent around it. She sat still, her hands folded neatly on her lap, her coffee cooling on the tray table. Outwardly, she was invisible. But inwardly, her pilot's instincts burned bright. She knew the language of skies, the choreography of air traffic, the way even unseen forces could shift the destiny of a single flight. And though no one else in seat 22A through 22F could know it, the events set in motion above them were about to change everything. The woman in 22C wasn't just another passenger caught in a delay. She was about to become the reason the skies paid attention. The air in the cabin shifted, subtle but undeniable. It wasn't turbulence, nor was it the recycled rush of oxygen through overhead vents. It was the atmosphere of anticipation, a tension that seemed to grip passengers in its invisible hold. Every eye was alert, every whisper laced with excitement. Air Force One was near. The woman in 22C sat perfectly still, her spine straight, her hands folded loosely in her lap. To an outsider, she seemed almost indifferent. But behind her calm exterior, her mind was calculating, mapping the invisible corridors of the skies above. She could almost feel the presence of the other aircraft, as though her body remembered the weight of her helmet, the hum of the jet, the faint vibration in her bones when flying near the president's plane. Then it happened. The intercom chimed again, and this time the captain's voice carried a note of formality, sharpened around the edges. "Ladies and gentlemen, please remain seated. We've been instructed to prepare for an escort through restricted airspace. This is standard protocol when traveling near Air Force One. You'll notice some changes in our altitude and heading shortly." Nothing to be concerned about. The cabin erupted. Passengers gasped, craned their necks toward the windows, exchanged hurried words with their neighbors. Phones were raised, though the windows revealed nothing but sunlit sky. The very mention of an escort thrilled them. This was no longer an ordinary flight. They were brushing against history, proximity to power. But for the woman in 22C, the words landed differently. Escort protocol was routine to her, part of the unspoken ballet of air defense. She knew exactly what was happening, down to the radio exchanges between cockpits. And she knew something else. If their commercial jet was being given this kind of treatment, air traffic control had already pulled up the manifest. They knew every passenger on board. Her name was on that list, and with it her call sign. The cabin buzzed with speculation. The businessman in the next row leaned into the aisle, whispering animatedly, "Do you think we'll see fighters? F-16s, maybe? Or Raptors?" A teenager pressed his face against the window, grinning. "Man, this is like a movie." The couple across the aisle seized the moment, their voices rising above the chatter. "Well," the man said, grinning smugly, "looks like we'll finally see some real pilots today. Not the kind who just talk about it." He shot a glance at 22C, his tone dripping with mockery. "Hope you're taking notes." His companion chuckled, sipping her wine. "Yes, maybe she can get some tips." This time, though, their words were cut short, not by her, but by the flight attendant moving briskly down the aisle. She stopped at 22C, her expression a mix of confusion and respect. "Ma'am," the attendant said quietly, leaning closer so others couldn't hear. "The captain has asked if you can step toward the front of the cabin for a moment." The nearby passengers froze. Every head turned toward 22C, curiosity sharp in their eyes. The woman blinked once, slowly. She hadn't expected it this soon. Still, she nodded without hesitation, rising smoothly from her seat. Her movements carried the quiet grace of someone long accustomed to discipline, and though she didn't say a word, the air around her seemed to shift. She followed the attendant up the aisle, the low murmur of whispers trailing in her wake. "Why her?" someone hissed. "Who is she?" The mocking man leaned toward his companion, smirking. "Probably in trouble. Maybe she snuck something on board," but his laughter wavered as he watched the flight attendant lead her not into the lavatory, not into a curtained corner, but straight to the cockpit door. The attendant spoke briefly into the interphone, then nodded and motioned for her to wait. A second later, the door cracked open, revealing the captain's face, serious, professional, and strangely deferential. "Major," he said quietly, his voice carrying just enough for her to hear. "We received a request. Washington confirmed. They'd like to verify your call sign." The word struck the cabin like a silent thunderclap. "Major." Passengers exchanged shocked glances, whispers erupting. The couple across the aisle stiffened, their smug expressions melting into disbelief. The woman inclined her head slightly, her voice calm and steady. "Of course, Captain." She leaned close, speaking quietly, her words meant only for him. She gave her call sign, the name etched into records, the one recognized across bases and command posts, the one whispered with respect in hangars and briefing rooms. A name that carried weight. The captain's eyes widened almost imperceptibly. He nodded sharply, then keyed his radio. Static crackled faintly from within the cockpit, voices overlapping, clipped and precise. She couldn't hear the exact exchange, but she knew the rhythm. Confirmation, recognition, clearance. Then the captain glanced back at her, his expression shifting from formality to something closer to awe. "They asked me to thank you for your service," he said quietly, "and to let you know they'll be diverting for Escort." Her lips curved into the faintest hint of a smile, though she said nothing. She simply nodded again and returned to her seat, her composure unbroken. But the cabin was no longer the same. Whispers flared, passengers twisting in their seats to look at her. Did he just call her Major? Call sign? What does that mean? Wait, she's military? Like real military? The businessman who had mocked her earlier sat frozen, his face pale. His companion leaned in, whispering frantically, as though trying to make sense of what they had just heard. When she slid back into 22C, all eyes were on her. She placed her hands calmly in her lap, her expression serene, as though nothing unusual had happened at all. But the balance of the cabin had shifted. The same people who had laughed at her now stared with unease, their curiosity tinged with respect they didn't yet understand. The mocking couple avoided her gaze, their earlier bravado shriveled into silence. She didn't gloat, didn't smirk, didn't so much as glance their way. She simply sat, patient, composed, waiting for what came next. And soon it came. A murmur rose from the windows. Passengers leaned close to the glass, gasps breaking the quiet. "Look," someone shouted. Out there, the sky had changed. From the blue expanse above, two sleek silhouettes had appeared, sliding into formation beside the commercial jet. Jets real, living steel, and fire escorting them with precision. And though none of the passengers knew it yet, they weren't there for the plane. They were there for the woman in 22C, the woman whose name carried weight in the skies. The first jet appeared like a phantom from the endless blue, slicing cleanly into view beside the commercial aircraft. Its nose angled with effortless precision, wings glinting in the sunlight. A collective gasp rippled through the cabin as passengers scrambled toward the windows, pressing their faces to the glass, phones in hand, voices rising in disbelief. Another silhouette emerged moments later, sweeping in from the opposite side until both fighters held. Formation 2 Guardians flanking their passenger jet with surgical symmetry. The sight was extraordinary for civilians, the kind of thing usually reserved for news footage or military documentaries. But here it was, unfolding live outside their windows, close enough for them to see the gleam of helmets through tinted canopies. The cabin had become a theater of awe. Gasps, cheers, exclamations filled the air. "Oh my God, are those F-16s?" Someone cried. "They're here for us? Are we in danger?" Another asked, though their voice trembled more with excitement than fear. Children pointed, their wide eyes sparkling, while adults fumbled to capture the moment on shaky phone cameras. The spectacle had turned the mundane flight into something legendary, a story every passenger would one day tell with trembling hands and breathless pride. But amid the chaos, one figure remained utterly composed. The woman in 22C. She sat quietly, her gaze steady on the window as the jets glided into formation. There was no shock in her eyes, no wide-mouthed astonishment. Only the faint glimmer of recognition, of familiarity, as though she were greeting old comrades rather than witnessing an extraordinary display. The mocking couple across the aisle had gone silent. Their earlier laughter now seemed like a distant memory, swallowed by the reality outside. The man's face was pale, his jaw tight as he muttered under his breath, This can't be for her." But his companion's voice betrayed doubt. They called her Major. The captain asked for her call sign. "You heard him." The man shook his head weakly, but his bravado had evaporated. Every stolen glance at 22C revealed the truth. She wasn't rattled. She wasn't confused. She wasn't like them. She belonged to the sky. The captain's voice came over the intercom again, but this time it carried a weight absent before. "Respect, reverence. Ladies and gentlemen," he said, his tone steady. "As you can see, we are currently being escorted. This is a rare honor, and I'd like to take a moment to recognize one of our passengers, without whom this would not be happening. Some of you may already be aware, but for those who aren't major, your call sign has been acknowledged, and this escort is for you." The cabin fell into stunned silence. It wasn't just rumor now, not whispered speculation. The captain himself had confirmed it. Dozens of eyes turned toward 22C, searching her face for confirmation, for some reaction. But she gave them none. She sat with quiet dignity, her hands folded in her lap, her gaze fixed calmly ahead. The jets outside didn't surprise her. They were old friends, shadows she had flown beside before. The businessman in the row ahead exhaled sharply. "Major," he whispered. "She's really military, high-ranking." His seatmate nodded, wide-eyed. "More than that. Did you hear the captain? They requested her call sign. That doesn't happen for just anyone." The mocking woman's cheeks flushed crimson. She lowered her eyes, her earlier arrogance evaporating into embarrassed silence. Her companion shifted uncomfortably in his seat, stealing glances at 22C, but unable to summon the nerve to speak. For the first time since boarding, the balance of power in the cabin had shifted entirely. Where there had been ridicule, now there was reverence. Where there had been whispers, now there was awe. The escort outside tightened formation, the sleek fighters dipping their wings slightly, a gesture of acknowledgement, almost salute. Gasps filled the cabin again as passengers pointed wildly. "Did you see that? They signaled to us." But she knew better. That dip of wings wasn't for the plane. It was for her. The memory of her call sign, transmitted across encrypted channels, still lingered in the air like an invisible echo. Somewhere above, the pilots in those cockpits had heard her name, had recognized it, had adjusted their flight plan, not for the airliner, but for the major sitting quietly in coach seat 22C. and though no one in the cabin truly understood the weight of it, they felt it nonetheless. The invisible respect carried by her name now filled the space between them all. She didn't revel in their stares, didn't bask in their awe. For her, this wasn't theater, it was duty, extending far beyond the walls of this aircraft. She had flown these skies before, escorted leaders and shielded lives without a shred of recognition. Today was no different. But for the passengers, it was everything. The teenager with his phone whispered, "I'll never forget this." A mother held her child close, murmuring, "That woman kept us safe." She must have done it before too. Even the flight attendants, usually so composed, exchanged looks of disbelief as they moved down the aisle, their professional masks cracked by wonder. The couple across the aisle remained frozen in silence. Their earlier sneers now seemed childish, their mocking words fragile things shattered by reality. The woman risked a glance toward 22C, her lips parting as though she might speak an apology. But the Major's calm composure silenced her before she could. This wasn't the moment for apologies. It was the moment for truth. Outside, the jets held steady, gleaming guardians against the vast expanse of sky. Their presence transformed the ordinary into the extraordinary, each second stretching into eternity. For the passengers, it was the experience of a lifetime. For the woman in 22C, it was simply another chapter in the story of her service. The engines hummed. The cabin buzzed with awe. And in the heart of it all, the Major sat quietly, her name unspoken yet thundering louder than any jet outside. The Escort in the sky was no spectacle for her. It was recognition, not of her face, not of her seat number, but of the call sign that carried weight, the name that spoke louder than the mocking laughter ever could. And as the fighters glided gracefully through the blue, the truth became undeniable. She was not invisible. She was not forgotten. She was the reason the skies themselves had bent that day. The cabin was alive with the low hum of engines, but the energy inside had transformed completely. Where there had once been whispers of mockery, now there was reverent silence, punctuated only by the occasional gasp from passengers pressed to the windows. Everyone's attention had shifted, drawn magnetically toward seat 22C. The woman in 22C remained calm, composed, her posture perfectly straight, her hands resting lightly in her lap. She didn't smile, didn't wave, didn't acknowledge the newfound attention. To an untrained eye, she seemed still and quiet, unaffected by the spectacle that surrounded her. But her mind was alert, noting every subtle movement of the escort jets, every expression on the faces of the passengers around her. The couple across the aisle, the very ones who had whispered cruelly and snickered at her appearance, could no longer maintain their composure. The man's shoulders slumped, as if he carried the weight of embarrassment itself. He whispered frantically to his partner, but even the words stumbled out in a mixture of disbelief and shame. She really is Major," the woman whispered. Her voice quivered, not from awe alone, but from the shame of her earlier derision. "All that?" We laughed at her. Her companion nodded slowly, staring straight ahead at 22C, his earlier smugness replaced with something akin to reverence. Neither dared speak further. Their laughter had been silenced, not by argument or confrontation, but by truth, the truth they could now see with their own eyes, and feel in the unspoken authority that radiated from the Major. A mother sitting several rows ahead pressed her child's hand to her chest, murmuring softly, "See, sweetie? Courage comes in quiet packages." The child nodded solemnly, eyes wide, fixated on the calm figure who had become the center of attention. Even the flight attendants, trained to maintain composure in any situation, were quietly glancing back toward 22C. Their professionalism remained intact, but there was a ripple of astonishment in their eyes. They had witnessed passengers' reactions to emergencies before, but nothing quite like this, the quiet power of a single individual commanding respect without a single gesture. The cabin, once a stage for ridicule and laughter, had become a sanctuary of awe. Every passenger now shared the same realization. The woman they had underestimated was someone extraordinary. And the escort in the sky, the two gleaming jets slicing through the blue in flawless formation, was a tribute, not to the plane, but to her. The teenager pressed his face to the window again, his phone trembling in his hands. I can't believe it," he whispered. "She's amazing." A businessman in the row ahead cleared his throat nervously. I owe her an apology," he said quietly, mostly to himself. "I judged her entirely wrong." The major, as always, remained composed. She didn't hear these words. She wasn't seeking them. Her satisfaction came from a deeper, quieter place, the knowledge that her actions, her service, her dedication, had finally been recognized, even if indirectly. Recognition in the skies, not in the noisy chatter of strangers, was more than enough. She thought briefly about her life, the missions that had defined her, the challenges faced in foreign skies, the moments when her courage had been tested to its limits. All of it had led to this flight, to this moment in time, and the truth was finally undeniable. The woman who had once been humiliated in 22C, dismissed as ordinary, was now at the center of extraordinary respect. The first fighter jet dipped its wings slightly, a subtle gesture that spoke volumes. Another dip followed, synchronized perfectly. Any pilot would recognize it as a salute. Any passenger could only gape in awe. The cabin fell silent again, and the shift was palpable. Even the murmurs had diminished, replaced by the quiet respect that settled like a blanket over the passengers. People looked at 22C with new eyes, a recognition that transcended words. She was no longer invisible. She was undeniably present, undeniably significant. Her eyes drifted briefly to the mocking couple. They avoided her gaze, each lost in their own internal reckoning. The man shifted awkwardly in his seat, leaning back as if attempting to disappear. The woman pressed her hands to her mouth, swallowing hard. Both seemed to understand, finally, that respect could not be demanded. It could only be earned. And she had earned it, not with words, but with a lifetime of action and service. Nearby passengers whispered among themselves, recounting the sudden reversal in perception. "She must have flown escort missions before," one woman said. "I've heard pilots talk about call signs. This must be the one." The realization spread like wildfire, infecting every corner of the cabin. People who had been indifferent, bored, or dismissive now looked toward 22C with admiration. Children sat in awe, parents nodded knowingly, and even the most skeptical adults couldn't deny the truth. She remained still, absorbing the moment with quiet dignity. Humility had been her shield for years. Now it was her crown. The acknowledgement in the sky, the unspoken respect, was all she needed. No words, no gestures, no applause, just the recognition that her service, her courage, and her sacrifices had been validated, finally. She thought about the irony of the situation. She had endured mockery in that very seat, whispered insults and laughter directed at her appearance, her seat assignment, her perceived ordinariness. And now, every one of those whispers had been silenced, not by confrontation, but by truth, by her presence, by her quiet power. The escort jets began to adjust their positions slightly, guiding the commercial plane along the safe corridor. The major's eyes followed them, calculating the movements almost instinctively, noting how each adjustment maintained formation and security. She felt the familiar calm of a pilot, a sense of control, even in a situation that was largely ceremonial for the passengers. The captain's voice came over the intercom once more, this time carrying a tone of understated awe. "Ladies and gentlemen, you are witnessing a rare honor. The escort you see outside is not for the aircraft. but for a passenger on board. Major, your call sign has been recognized, and these pilots salute your service. Thank you for your dedication and courage. A murmur of astonishment swept through the cabin. The words confirmed what everyone had begun to suspect, but could hardly believe. The woman in 22C was extraordinary. The Major allowed herself a subtle nod, barely perceptible, acknowledging the recognition without letting it break her composure. It was enough. That nod carried centuries of tradition, discipline, and quiet service, spoken through a gesture smaller than a heartbeat, but weighty with meaning. Passengers turned toward each other, sharing astonished glances, some whispering apologies, others simply nodding in newfound respect. The mocking couple had gone completely silent, their earlier arrogance replaced with stunned humility. For the first time, the woman in 22C felt the profound shift she had long anticipated. The world had finally caught up, if only for this fleeting moment, to the truth of her life in the skies. Outside, the escort jets held steady, sleek, and silent sentinels in the blue, reflecting sunlight off their polished surfaces. They were guardians, yes, but they were also messengers, carrying word of her service through the vast emptiness of the airspace. Every movement, every synchronized maneuver, was a salute, and every passenger, knowingly or unknowingly, had become witness to it. She exhaled softly, a quiet relief settling over her. Humiliation had been replaced with acknowledgement. Dismissal had been replaced with respect. Mockery had been replaced with awe. And all of it had happened without her raising her voice, without confrontation, without demanding recognition. Because the truth, she knew, always carried its own weight. The cabin remained hushed as passengers absorbed what they had seen. Conversations resumed slowly, carefully, as if no one wanted to disturb the reverence that had taken hold. Phones were still raised, cameras capturing images, but there was a new humility in the eyes that looked toward 22C. She returned her attention to the window, watching the escort jets glide alongside, maintaining their protective formation. The sky had become a canvas, and she had, invisibly, painted her legacy across it. The shift in the cabin was complete. Where there had been ridicule, there was now respect. Where there had been whispers, there was awe. And through it all, the Major remained quiet, her dignity intact, a testament to the power of service, humility, and skill. For the first time that day, Seat 22C felt like a place of honor. The escort jets flanked the commercial plane for several minutes, their presence a silent testament to the Major, seated quietly in 22C. Each subtle maneuver, each perfectly synchronized dip of the wings seemed almost ceremonial. For the passengers, it was mesmerizing an unprecedented spectacle of power and precision. For the woman in 22C, it was simply part of her world, a familiar rhythm that had long defined her life. Inside the cabin, the atmosphere had transformed completely. The whispers of doubt, the murmurs of mockery, had disappeared entirely, replaced by reverent silence. Eyes that had once rolled with derision now watched with awe, absorbing the reality of the extraordinary life that had unfolded in the person beside them. The couple across the aisle, once smug and mocking, now sat frozen in their seats. The man's hands gripped his knees. His companion had buried her face in her hands, a flush of embarrassment visible even from a distance. Neither dared speak. Any words now would have seemed insufficient, meaningless even, compared to the undeniable truth hovering just beyond the windows. Passengers murmured to each other, unsure how to process what they had witnessed. She really is Major, a young woman whispered to her husband, voice trembling with awe. They diverted Air Force One's escort for her. Can you believe it? The husband shook his head slowly, swallowing hard. All this time? We judged her by her seat, her bag, nothing else. We were so wrong. A child nearby tugged at a parent's sleeve. "Mom, she's like a superhero," the child exclaimed, pointing toward 22C. The mother smiled softly, squeezing the child's hand. "Not a superhero," she whispered. "A major, and she's been protecting people quietly for years." The woman in 22C remained still, serene, absorbing the moment with practiced composure. She didn't respond to the whispers, didn't look around for validation. Recognition had arrived not through applause, not through words, but through the precise choreography of steel and sky outside, the silent acknowledgement from those who knew her call sign. That was more than enough. For a moment, she allowed herself a small internal smile. Humility had always been her guiding principle, but in this fleeting moment, she could savor the quiet triumph of service recognized. It was not for show. It was not for praise. It was simply acknowledgement of a life dedicated to duty. The captain's voice broke the soft murmur, calm yet infused with authority and respect. "Ladies and gentlemen," he began, "our escort will remain with us until we leave the restricted airspace. Once again, I want to acknowledge Major in seat 22C. Her service and dedication have been recognized at the highest levels. We are honored to escort her safely through this portion of our flight." A ripple of stunned admiration passed through the cabin. Some passengers struggled to process it fully. Others stared at 22C as though seeing her for the first time. The mocking couple finally exchanged a glance, shame and awe wrestling in their expressions. The man opened his mouth to speak, but no words came. His companion whispered something low, almost inaudible, and neither looked at the major again. Outside, the escort jets adjusted formation slightly, signaling the end of the ceremonial segment. The plane's course was now clear, though the jets continued to flank them, providing a sense of protection and gravitas. Passengers pressed against the windows, capturing the final moments with phones, cameras, and eyes that refused to forget. The woman in 22C allowed herself a deep, controlled breath. She had endured ridicule, mockery, and dismissal just hours ago. Now she was met not with laughter, but with respect. Not with assumptions, but with acknowledgement. It was the culmination of decades of dedication. Every decision, every flight, every risk taken in the sky, recognized at last, even if silently, even if from strangers who had only just learned her truth. The rest of the flight passed in a hushed reverence. Passengers spoke in quiet tones, the earlier chatter replaced by subdued awe. Some exchanged knowing glances, still grappling with the reality of what had unfolded. Many turned to the major, hoping for a glance, a smile, a gesture of acknowledgement. But she remained composed, serene, a figure of quiet authority that needed no affirmation from anyone. As the plane began its descent, the escort jets peeled off, banking smoothly to return to their own flight paths. Their departure was almost ceremonial, a silent farewell to the major whose service had earned their presence. Passengers pressed their faces to the windows for one last glimpse, hearts pounding with the realization that they had witnessed something extraordinary. The captain's voice came over the intercom one final time. "Ladies and gentlemen, we are beginning our final approach. It has been a unique honor to share this flight with Major in seat 22C. On behalf of the crew and the escort pilots, thank you for your patience and for witnessing this rare acknowledgement." The cabin was quiet, almost sacred. People stared at 22C with awe and gratitude, some quietly mouthing apologies, others nodding in respect. No one needed to speak aloud. The acknowledgement hung in the air like a tangible force. When the plane touched down smoothly on the runway, the applause was hesitant at first, but it grew steadily. Passengers clapped, some standing, their expressions a mixture of relief, respect, and admiration. She didn't join in. She didn't turn to smile. She simply remained seated, dignified, calm, her eyes forward, taking in the moment with quiet satisfaction. The passengers now saw what had been invisible before: the quiet heroism of service, the courage that went unseen, the skill and dedication required to protect lives without expectation of recognition. She had been humiliated in 22C, dismissed, mocked, and underestimated. Now she was acknowledged, respected, and honored, not for appearances, but for the substance of her character and deeds. As the passengers disembarked, many paused to offer quiet words of thanks or admiration. Some extended their hands, unsure how to convey the gratitude they felt. Others simply nodded, a gesture of acknowledgement that transcended words. The couple across the aisle hung back, embarrassment etched on their faces, a quiet apology in their silence. The woman's eyes met 22C's briefly, and though the major said nothing, the look itself carried the weight of understanding and forgiveness. She walked down the aisle, collected her bag, and paused at the exit. The flight attendants offered polite smiles, a subtle recognition of the extraordinary events that had unfolded. Even in their professionalism, there was acknowledgement. They knew they had witnessed someone remarkable, a person whose service transcended the ordinary. Stepping off the plane, she didn't turn back. She didn't need to. A memory of the escort, the shift in perception, and the acknowledgement of her presence would remain with the passengers long after they returned to their ordinary lives. The story they would tell about the woman in 22C, the major, and the jets that had flanked her would grow in legend, each retelling adding to the quiet immortality of her deeds. For her part, she felt a profound sense of peace. Humiliation had been replaced by recognition, doubt had been replaced by respect, and invisibility had been replaced by a quiet, undeniable presence. Yet she remained the same humble, disciplined, and committed to service. That was who she was. That was what mattered. And as she walked away from the plane, the echoes of engines and jets fading into memory, she carried with her the satisfaction of a life well lived, a duty well performed, and the knowledge that her quiet strength had finally been seen. Seat 22C, once a place of humiliation, had become a place of honor.